exactly constitutes metal being mainstream, and has there really ever been a metal band that could be considered mainstream? Mainstream has always been a term that's kind of like perplexed me, because I think it more often than not can be a little subjective, because where is the line drawn between mainstream versus underground, mainstream versus adjacent to mainstream? Is mainstream just you see it on a billboard, you see it in a TV show? Is it something that's used in a big blockbuster movie? Is it something that 1 million people know, 10 million people know, 100 million people know? Is it determined by how many platforms you're on, how many tickets you sell at a stadium? Is it something based on how ravenous and devout your fan base is, or does that mean nothing at all? Does mainstream have to do with you mean something to the culture? Does it mean that if no one knows anything about you as a person but knows your music, that you're mainstream enough? Or does it have to be something that's just you're a household name, and if you're brought up, people are gonna recognize you? These are all pretty interesting questions to ask, because I think we throw around the term, this is mainstream, this has mainstream appeal, but what exactly does that mean? And has metal ever gone that far? I think that the answer, in the way that most people would define mainstream, would be yes. I think that there have been some metal bands that have bled through into the mainstream. Metal, most of the time, has kind of become a little desensitized. Most of the time, people aren't gonna just scoff at you if you listen to metal or enjoy metal, but that wasn't how it always was. There were times when metal had a lot of stereotypes attached to it, and while there are still gonna be people that carry those sentiments into the modern era, it's not nearly gonna be what it used to be. The way that I would personally define mainstream, I think that it mostly means if you are brought up, are people going to at least recognize who you are, or have some sort of point of reference as to what band you are, what artist you are, maybe what you look like, maybe what you sound like. I don't think that the criteria necessarily has to be you know all of their songs, you know how they go, you know their lyrics, you know their vocalist's name. I would argue that there's like no one that doesn't know who Taylor Swift is in the United States, but I would feel like out of the people who would know her name, only a small fraction of that would actively be able to list you her songs or her albums, facts about her. And it's interesting to me because to dissect it, I think that metal has to work harder to be considered mainstream than most other things. We assume straight off the bat that genres like hip-hop music or EDM, specifically mainstream pop music, are automatically mainstream. They don't really have to work for that. There are artists that have 100,000, 500,000 monthly listeners, and they are called mainstream solely because of the genre they come from and the type of music that they perform. But for metal to be to that level, it is much more difficult. There are plenty of bands that, in reference for this video, I went and researched on like monthly listeners on Spotify, and bands that have millions of listeners on Spotify that are metal bands, I would guarantee that if I go down the road and ask people who they are, it's going to be few and far between people who actually know them. Era recently hit 1 million monthly listeners on Spotify, but I don't think the average person, unless you are involved in metal, are going to know what that is. And it obviously comes down to the key word in all of this big puzzle: accessibility, some sort of crossover appeal. But I also don't want to sell short the fact that you have to sell out to the big man to be able to go mainstream or sell out big stadiums. And for however many success stories you want to say of bands changing their style to be more accessible and digestible to a more widespread audience, there are plenty of times in metal history where a band that was very heavy, aggressive, and did not compromise their style became sort of a cultural phenomenon, either for their aesthetic or for their music as a whole. Thrash metal did this a lot. Metallica, Megadeth, as well as Slayer and Anthrax. Grunge, being metal adjacent, did this in the 1990s. A lot of new metal bands were pretty edgy and on the fringe, and even nowadays you see bands like Lorna Shore getting on big vocal coach series like Will Ramos on YouTube, as well as Knocked Loose becoming bigger and bigger and maintaining more momentum and somehow turning their style up to be even more aggressive than it was in the past. So I don't think that it's easy enough to just say, oh, if you're an Asking Alexandria or a Bring Me the Horizon and you make your style more digestible, automatically you're welcome into the club, because I think that some of the biggest names in metal didn't do that whatsoever. I don't think bands like Slipknot or System of a Down or Pantera, Linkin Park to some degree, Knocked Loose, Lorna Shore have changed their style at all, and if anything, doubled down on the fact that they were unique and they were doing something really freakish and out there and cool. The thrash metal and speed metal bands didn't try to fuck around with their style, and at the time, even though it might seem like child's play nowadays just because we're a little bit numb to it, a lot of the early heavy metal bands were very edgy and pushed the line of what you could do and still get that mainstream popularity. But it's interesting to me that the numbers, the sheer number numbers that you have to do as a metal band to bleed into the mainstream is kind of interesting. And I've noticed a trend that all of the genres and all of the bands that have bled into the mainstream obviously are going to have something unique to them, and I think it's a cool conversation to have because people are always looking for something new, something fresh, something that they've never heard before, and oftentimes these bands can be the entry points, the gateway bands into other heavier forms of metal. And most of the time, even if they aren't the most digestible, they have something that is appealing to people from the outside looking in, either from a lyrical department, the way that they look, the way that their arts are. There usually is something that you can kind of draw a point and say, I can see why someone might like it. I mean, Pantera, for example, took a lot of southern rock and hard rock influences and put that into groove metal. Linkin Park had the hip-hop influence. Metallica was pretty fucking catchy and groovy, even if they were heavy. Same with Megadeth. Slayer had really good guitar playing and solo work. The list goes on and on. There's always sort of these points where you can say, yeah, I can kind of understand why someone that is outside looking in would find it interesting to listen to, because it's not like the most brutal of death metal bands. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I think that it is going to be really few and far between to find really extreme metal bands that are able to become very popular. MTV helped a lot with that by putting bands like Death and Morbid Angel and Cannibal Corpse on their videos, specifically like Beavis and Butthead, broadcasting their stuff. That was a big deal for like death metal, but with that being said, nowadays any new like brutal death metal band that's coming around, or very heavy deathcore band or slam band or black metal band, chances are it's just a harsh reality that you're never going to have the same acclaim as some of the biggest heavy metal bands, because they kind of lucked into it in many ways and they were just doing their own thing. And I think that's the lesson to take away, is a lot of the most popular metal bands didn't really compromise or sacrifice their style to get to the point that they are, and they didn't necessarily change their style over time either. They just made kick-ass music and it bled through the cracks and really was endearing to a lot of people. What are your guys' opinions of this topic? Do you think that metal has been mainstream, and what do you think metal has to be mainstream in your definition of it? There is no wrong answer. Be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.